Lawrence Krauss, and welcome to the Origins Podcast. In this episode, I had the opportunity to talk to one of my favorite people, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who has had a remarkable life, and I've admired her for a long time and been pleased to say that she's a friend of mine. She has constantly put herself in harm's way to speak out in favor of freedom and against oppression throughout the world, but particularly the Islamic world from which she emerged and from which she was saved when she went to Europe in the first place. She not only has had her life threatened, in part initially in the Netherlands because of working on a film with Theo van Gogh about the oppression of women in the Islamic world, but then was catapulted to international fame with her book Infidel, which further inflamed some people. She has moved to the United States and continues to be an outspoken advocate for free expression against the oppression of women and in favor of basically free and creative activity in an open society. And I've continued to enjoy her writing since then. Her most recent book, Pray, deals with an issue which isn't talked about as much as she thinks it should be, which is really the changing face of Europe due to Islamic immigration and how it could be managed better than it is. In particular, the fact that people don't want to discuss what is emerging to be a real problem, which is the assault on women and oppression of women, both women from the Islamic world and Western women as a result of the immigration. And she thinks it could be handled in a more humane and equitable way and make society better rather than worse. I wanted to talk to her about that, as well as many other things, including her fascinating life. And it was a great conversation, I think, and I hope you enjoy it as well. If you're watching us on YouTube, I hope that you'll subscribe to the Origins Podcast. It will help us and I'll help you because you'll learn more about upcoming episodes. And if you want to help support the foundation, which really creates the podcast, please consider subscribing to us on our Patreon channel. Either whether you're watching it on Patreon or YouTube or listening to it on iTunes or Spotify, I hope you enjoy the podcast, and I'm pretty sure you will, especially if you've never had the opportunity to listen to Ayaan Hirsi Ali. She's a complete delight. Well, thank you, Ayaan, for being with me. I'm just so happy to be with you. It's always such a pleasure. Thank you.
It's always such a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Yes, it's great to follow up. I did a podcast with you, and now I get to ask you questions, and it's a pleasure. And of course, I always enjoy researching because I learn more about you, and I was always in awe of you before, but now I'm in more awe than I was before.
Please don't. You'll make me very nervous. Yeah.
Okay. Well, look, but first this is an Origins podcast, and before I want to spend a lot of time on your new book, Pray, and which I've gone through in detail, which is as all your books, very brave discussion of dealing with a social problem that people don't like to talk about. But first, I want to talk about your origins and how you got to where you were. I want to know first about your mother and father. Your father was an activist, and he was elected, was he, or he was in the Somali Salvation Democratic Front? He was a politician as well.
Yes, a rebel. The Somali Salvation Front was the group of politicians, their donors, and militia that stood up to our dictator, Mohammed Siad Barre, who he seized office in October of 1969. And before that, it was after independence. I think Somalia became independent in 1960. There were attempts with, the old colonial powers, the UK, Britain, and Italy, to set up a democracy. And my father was one of those young people who were educated and who were seen as potential leaders. He got a degree here in the United States. And I think he had this dream that with independence, Somalia could become like the US. And he thought of himself as one of the founding fathers and all that, very romantic, very idealistic. And then very quickly, what happens in Somalia is what happened in many other African countries. Someone from within the newly created military thinks, all this democracy and talking, to hell with them. I'm going to take power, and that happened. And Mohammed Siad Barre took power in October of 1969 and stayed in power all the way to January, if you call that power. The last few years were not so good, but up to January of 90, I would say December 31, 1990.
Well, now your father was imprisoned then, is that right?
Yeah, my father was one of those people who, so the two ways that dictators in Africa deal with their opponents.
Yeah.
They blow them up. So the sitting president was blown up in an airplane. And then people like my father were put in prison. And then the opposition responds, if they make it alive, of course, by escaping from prison. And so my father was one of those people who was helped by a relative out of prison. And I think the story that I heard, and I have no way ever of verifying these things, but the story we were told as his children was that it was a relative who was had a managerial position at the prison, who let him out. And then my father walked to the border with Ethiopia, and that's how he got out. And he wasn't the only one, there were others, but that's how lots of people were escaping.
Yeah, I was wondering how he escaped from prison, whether it was normally it's not so easy, but
Yeah.
now what was he, you say he studied in the US. What did he study?
Political science. And he dabbled in anthropology. He became really fascinated with making Somalia a literate country. So I don't know how much you know about Somalia, but Somalia is an oral culture. There's very little that Somalis wrote down at the time, and over 90% of the population was illiterate. So he went on these campaigns of trying to get the population to learn how to read and write. And he developed, his cousin developed this, it's called Esmania, a script for writing Somali. And my father developed that, spent a lot of time trying to get money to get typewriters for that and typeset. And he and my mother met at one of those campaigns where she was persuaded to go somewhere to learn how to read and write, and he was the teacher.
Oh, he was her teacher. Oh, that's kind of nice.
Well,
I
he
like
decided
that, although
there weren't any teachers, so he said, "Well, I'm going to teach it." So he
okay.
was. He did, had this anthropological interest, did political science, and decided that some of the work, there was no one to do it, so he was going to do it. He was very, very active and energetic.
Yes. Well, look, that be so many questions. Interesting that she married her teacher in a way, but which happens and it's fine. Although nowadays it's profound.
Well, he had a university degree and she was illiterate, so you can imagine.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I'm glad it was allowed back then. But but since he was so interested in getting people literate, what about you? Was he insistent that you therefore learn, be literate and read? And did he encourage that academic aspect of your psyche?
Absolutely. And I don't know up to, how far he would have gone, but just to give you some context, I don't want to say he was fully Americanized. For instance, he had a wife, his first wife, whom he sent to the US to start and finish her degree. And she had difficulties getting through it, but he just insisted that she had to do it, and she wasn't allowed to come back to Somalia until she had gotten her degree. And she had a daughter for him, and the daughter was left in Somalia. Then meanwhile, he meets my mother in one of these classes, and he marries her, and he has 3 children, of which I'm one. And some of the children, we had a lot of children who died. But at that point, he's saying, I'm going to send my kids to school, all of them. And I'm lucky enough to say, I'm just so fortunate that he insisted that I go to school. So even though his father, if you look at my father, his culture of, Muslim, nomadic, collectivist, women need to be in their place, accepting of polygamy, he was part of all of that. And yet there was a part of him that was really serious about literacy and education.
And so it was a clash of cultures occurring within him as well as, yeah. And well, let's see. I was looking for information on your mother and I could not find it. Did your mother encourage also? I mean, she'd learned how to write because of your father. Did she also encourage your interest in reading and writing?
Up to a point. So she was really much more traditional, much more rigid in her beliefs and in the wider, uh, normatively, she was formed by that context. And so initially she did encourage going to school and learning how to read and write. And she dropped out of school when my brother was born. So my father would send her a letter, and then she would ask my brother, who was about 10 years or so, to read the letter to her. And she would say, that's what I don't want for you. I want you to learn how to read and write so you can read your husband's letters. But that's about the boundary of it all. And so my mother's story is very interesting because she was born in a very nomadic setting. That is where people go from waterhole to waterhole.
Okay.
And modernity hadn't come to them at that time. And she is married off by her father to a man of his choice. 99% of girls, that's what was happening to them, unless they were orphans.
Mm-hmm.
And she dislikes the man he chooses for her on sight. Mm-hmm. But she goes through with the marriage because that's expected of her. And her father threatens her and says, if you divorce this man, I shall curse you and you shall spend the rest of your days in hell. She does. She goes through with it, but she finds it unbearable. And he moves her from that nomadic setting background to Kuwait, where there is some kind of modern life. And it's there after they have one boy together that she decides she doesn't want to be with him anymore. And then she goes to Somalia. She goes back to Somalia and she goes to Mogadishu. And now Mogadishu is this emerging independent, the capital of an newly independent nation, and enrolls for these literacy classes. So that's her background. So she's, even within her own self, and in her own mind are all these sorts of clashes that are going on.
Remarkable. And when I think of your mother growing up in a nomadic area, waterhole to waterhole, and I see you, it's just amazing how in one generation the world can change. It's really, really remarkable. But I did read one thing that I read, a quote that your mother said to you, which really kind of impressed me. She said, I guess this was coming later. I read about it when you went to Netherlands to escape a forced marriage. She said she wanted you to finish your education so you could leave, leave your husband, or at least not be married to that man. So she said, anyway, that's what I read. She said that she wanted you to finish your education largely to be free, basically, from a forced marriage. Is that true?
No, she didn't say it that way. She would never, she wouldn't, from a normative, from her beliefs in God and in honor and in shame and that sort of thing. She wouldn't say, you should get an education to leave your husband.
Okay.
But she would say, if you find yourself in circumstances where the husband leaves you, which is what my father did to his first wife and to her. My father left all of us because he was so dedicated to his political program. And so she felt abandoned and angry. And she always used to say, when that happens to you, you should be in a place to lift yourself up.
Oh, that's a
but then
lesson for
all of
girl.
These constraints on it. And so it was she was a very paradoxical, it is a paradoxical figure.
She's still alive?
She's alive, yeah. She's alive. And I mean, I don't know if you've read Infidel. I've told this whole story, Infidel, first part of Nomad, but I had all of these conflicts with her, but you told me to do this. You said that if I didn't want to be with this man, I could leave. You left your own husband. And now you are. And then she would just go on and on about honor and shame and submission to God. And if you don't submit to God, how can you, if you don't surrender? How can you find salvation in the hereafter? And then, our conversations are that, this is 2003, 2004, our conversations, you can imagine, the directions in which they're heading.
Has she come to accept now that, in 2021, a little more where you're coming from?
She hasn't come to accept that I don't believe in life after death.
Okay.
And I think that that's nonsense. I tried really, really hard, sort of in my, you know, when you're new to
Yeah.
this kind of change, you feel this, I was just almost as fanatical as she was about trying to convince her there's no life
Yeah.
after death, as she was trying to convince me there is. And what I think ultimately did happen is I dropped that subject.
Sure.
I just said to her, you win, Mom.
Okay. At some point, it's not worth it, especially with your parents or children, either way.
Yeah.
Now, your
So
father.
that's the relationship we have there. So when I'm on, I have phone calls with her, and when I'm on those phone calls, it's just one big monologue, and I'm going until it's time to hang up, and then that's
Sure.
that.
I know what that's like.
Yeah.
It's good. You're a good daughter. Your father left. Left you? Did he stay in Somalia?
My father left. So my
He,
father
he
took.
went to Ethiopia, but did he come back?
Yeah. So
Sorry.
he walked to Ethiopia, and my mother managed to get my two siblings and me out of Somalia. And I think all of us were under the age of 10 at that point. And she didn't want to go to Ethiopia. We were at war with Ethiopia at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So she took us to Saudi Arabia, and we lived there for a year, and then we got deported. And then we left Saudi Arabia. And when we were told you have 24 hours to leave the country, no country was willing to take us except Ethiopia. So, and my mother was insisting we should be going to a Muslim country, so no other country wanted to have us. We flew from Jeddah to Khartoum in Sudan. The Sudanese government wouldn't let us in. We were at the airport for 4 nights. And then with the help of the UNHCR, my father spoke to the authorities in Ethiopia, and they said, you're welcome to be here. And so we ended up going to Ethiopia for a year and a half. My mother was miserable, lost the baby there. And then said, get me out of here, get me out of here. And then we ended up going to Kenya.
Yeah, Nairobi.
But my father's work, his political activism was in Ethiopia. And so he took us to Kenya, went back to Ethiopia, came back, hung out until 1981, and then said to my mother, you and the children are coming back with me to Ethiopia. And if you refuse that, I don't care, I'm going anyway. And so he was gone for 10 years, from 1981 to 1992.
And she stayed married to him?
Well, as a Muslim woman,
yeah,
you can't get a divorce easily. Yeah.
Well, let me put it this way. He stayed married to her. Okay.
He stayed married to her. He didn't let her go. He didn't let her. I don't know. They did talk about it, and my mom refused to talk to him when he came back. And there was just a lot of,
Okay. Oh, well, we'll skip that. But, every family has its dramas. But your dramas are more dramatic. But one thing that interests me, I knew you went to Kenya, and you were enrolled. You had a comfortable life, I read there, but you were enrolled in this Muslim school. I was surprised to see that a little bit. Was that your mother's doing, or was it more like in the United States where people enroll their kids in Catholic schools because their public schools are no good and sort of the religious schools are the only opportunities? So I wanted to ask which of those or both were the reason you went to a Muslim school.
So I went to a Muslim girls' secondary school.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And so remember, my father is not there at that time when I'm turning 13 to go to what I think you call here. Is that middle and high school or high school when you're 13 years old?
13 is probably middle school. Yeah.
Yeah, middle high. So when I'm enrolling, when she's, shopping for a school, she says, no, first of all, she has this argument with my father she says, okay, I'm going to pull the girls out of school because they're at that age. And that is where he says, if you do that, I'll curse you and you'll never find peace after your death and whatever. So she then starts to look for a school that is girls only, that is Muslim oriented, where you're allowed to wear the headscarf and so on. And that's how we came to that school. Now, that school used to be, when I went there, it was pretty moderate. And I haven't been back to the school itself, but with the internet, you can go look at the old school. And I find what a change a few decades make. What a change.
It's become less moderate, is that what you're telling me?
Now, all the girls are covered. It's now become a truly Islamist school. It was a Muslim girls' school, and now I think it is an Islamist school.
But I read that already that the Saudi Arabia was already funding those kind of schools, and it had become more of the Saudi, more rigorous interpretation of Islam even then, and you yourself sort of bought into it, right? I mean, even then.
the seeds were being planted during that time when I was there. So I went to that school in 1984. And by 1985, we have a teacher who had done her Sharia degree in Medina, Saudi Arabia, come back and teach us and show us that, we all identify ourselves as Muslim, but she completely disagreed and said, nothing that you guys say or do is Islamic. This is the new way of, and so that really was, for me, the transitioning from being a Muslim and becoming an Islamist.
Okay, and then you actually joined, at least supported the fatwa against someone we both know, Salman Rushdie, right?
Yeah, so then I'm from 13 to 1989, I was about to turn 19. By then I had completed high school. But in those years, and I mentioned, how this teacher comes to school with a degree from Medina and a lot of money from Saudi Arabia, but it wasn't only happening at school. It was also happening in the mosque. It was happening in the neighborhood. We were really changing as a community. We were transitioning to this Wahhabi posture.
Okay.
The Muslim Brotherhood came to our neck of the wood and were very active. And I became a volunteer. I signed up for it. I liked it. It gave me a place where I belonged. It gave me quite, I would say, a good definition between what's wrong, what's right, and how do you know the difference. And it gave me a sense of purpose. And I delighted my mother by showing up at home instead of this resistance as a teenager, where my sister wanted to wear mini skirts and shorts and tank tops because other girls were doing that. And I showed up in this big hijab, and she said, you're in God's hand, God is guiding you. And so she was delighted that for those many years, and yeah.
But it was reading that began to liberate you in a sense, right? You read English adventure stories, Nancy Drew, and you liked the idea of a strong woman who was sort of rebelling, which also followed in your father's footsteps, at least, right? But I was intrigued by something. You also thought of your grandmother as kind of an example because she refused soldiers. But was that the same grandmother who, while your father was away, forced the female genital mutilation that he had to undergo, or
Yes.
if you don't want to talk about it, we don't have to, but was it the same person?
Yes, that's my mother's mother. So when I was saying from waterhole to waterhole, my mother was, I don't know, maybe 17, 18, 19 years when she left that environment to go to a more urban environment. But my grandmother stayed there, and she became the enforcer of those rules. And then she came to us when my father went to prison to help my mother out, and she never left. She stayed with us. And in some ways, I felt she was more flexible than my mother, but in other ways, she was more rigid. And when these young people came from Saudi Arabia and they said, all these years, your Muslim rituals, your Islamic rituals were all wrong, she just used to scream them out of the house. Get out of my house, get out of my, and she would get them all out. So you couldn't bring these new things to her and insult her in any way. And when Mohammed Siad Barre's soldiers, so this is very early on, this is while we were still in Somalia, well, I was probably 6 or so years old, when these soldiers come and they are enforcing the new communist law that Siad Barre had brought into us. And part of that was the rationing of food. So every household was allowed an X amount of food. But we are a clan system. So my mother and they would talk to members of their, the brothers, the cousins, the nephews, and so on. And so they're able to smuggle a lot of food into the house. And here the soldiers come and they're going from door to door to see who had smuggled food in. And when they try to come through the front door, that's why my little grandmother goes and stands up to them with this needle that she uses for sewing baskets and mats. And she's standing there saying, how dare you? And you're not coming through the front door. And back then she was relying on the norm that if you're a younger person, and especially a man, you don't touch a woman. You don't, that's a very rigid tribal code, unless you are at war.
Mhm.
And so you could see that some of the young men, even though they were in uniform and were carrying guns, were very inhibited in dealing with this situation. And my grandmother standing there really looking very fierce.
Yeah.
But there were some young men who didn't have that inhibition and just pushed her over and into the room.
Oh.
And so for me, growing up and watching that, it was also clear that, old norms were being trampled on, new norms were coming along, not taking full form. And so this whole fluidity of change and the challenge that change brings, that's something I grew up with and saw.
Yeah, well, yeah. So you saw the change, but you also, I guess, had this experience of strong women. And would you consider your mother a strong woman as well?
Very, very strong. Yeah, very strong, but in some ways also very weak. And I would say in terms of her weaknesses, it is weirdly, it's coming from her strength, because if she wasn't so inflexible, she could, go with the flow. For instance, when we moved to Kenya, she hated the Kenyans. She hated life there. And so she refused to learn the language. She refused to learn English, she refused to learn Swahili. And that's the kind of, is that a strength or a weakness?
Yeah. Yes.
Strong enough to say, I'm not going to learn the language of the infidel, but it's, you're hurting yourself.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, it's biting off your nose to spite your face, as we say.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, I was just trying to. So, I want to move off this in a second. I think it's really important to lead up to where we're talking about. And first of all, not only is your background fascinating, but when we get to pray and we talk about the experience of immigration in Europe, I think this is useful. So, in any case, I want to continue it a little bit. But who do you think influenced you more, your mother or father?
I would say both of them, but in different ways.
Yeah.
And I think I thought I'm more influenced by my father because, of course, I romanticized him. He sent me to school. He was more modern and flexible and so open to things. And in that sense, I think, he influenced me. And, I love my father more than I love my mother because my mom is so hardcore, immovable. She said no to friends. She said no to everything. But I think in some ways she did influence me without even me being conscious of it, because I also find myself sometimes being really inflexible.
Well, we all become our parents in some ways, and some of us. I think I told you once when we talked, it's a foil. Sometimes my mother, who's now going to be 100 this week, sometimes when I catch myself behaving like her, it's a good lesson to change. Anyway, but you then. You did in 1992. You moved to the Netherlands, and and in this, a lot of it's well documented. But I mean, and you had problems, but you to escape an arranged marriage. But you became I was intrigued. You became a translator when you were in the Netherlands, for in a refugee camp, which
well, I was
sorry, go on.
So my translation background, I went to the Netherlands in 1992 after I escaped that marriage. And because when I was in Nairobi, when we were in Kenya, I went to part of elementary school, middle school, high school. I did all of that in English as my first language. So it's not my first language, but in Kenya, when you go to school, that's your first language. You go to school in English, not in Swahili, not in the tribal languages.
Interesting.
So I spoke English well enough when I was in the Netherlands, and I was put in an asylum seeker center to help out with some of the Somali residents. And for that, I wasn't paid. I was just volunteering. But as I was doing it, some of the people who work at the asylum seeker center were saying, you could actually get paid for this and make quite a bit of money, but you're not going to do it in English, Somali English. You have to learn Dutch. And then you do that in Dutch, Somali. And I looked into it and I thought, do you think I can learn Dutch? And
you did at that age. Well, you had 6 languages, but I guess maybe you had a lot of experience in languages. I've been trying to learn a new language. I speak French, but at this age, I'm trying to learn a few new languages, and it's Much more
Yeah.
difficult. Wow, that's great that you learned Dutch. And but then I was intrigued that you became at that time, in a premonition of the book Prey, in some sense, you
Yes.
became critical of the way the Netherlands was handling asylum seekers from that experience in the asylum area.
I mean, I think I started first with questions like, so when I'm among my Somali community inside the asylum seeker center, you have people who have come from a war-torn country, and they come into a place like the Netherlands, and they're given food and shelter and medicine, all of these things. And day in, day out, my Somali friends would say, I hate this place, I hate the weather, I hate the food, I hate the people. And so my reaction always was, well, what's the alternative? You're
Yeah.
not going back to Mogadishu.
Yeah.
And in order to move on, and I think a lot of Somalis who were able to make it to places like Europe, when the civil war broke out, they had homes, they had servants, they had occupations, they were making a lot of money as business people. And so when you go to a place like an asylum seeker center in Europe, you've lost all of that. You've lost all of your dignity. You feel really, really sorry for yourself. And some people, a small group of people would start over and say, okay, what is, where am I now? And what can I do to make these changes? But a majority of people just never did anything. They just kept getting these government handouts, and then go back to the same government and say, can you get members of my family out and bring them here? And the government would indulge that. So it's through asking. I went to the Dutch people who worked at the center and said, why are you giving us all of these things? Mm-hmm. And why are you welcoming us? And they would talk about laws and norms and treaties. And so anyway, my attitude was critical of both sides. And I thought it would be very good for my Somali friends if they were just given some tough love and told, get off your backsides and get on with it.
Well, but again, I think, talking about the difficulty of assimilating, which is going to be an issue we're going to deal with. That's certainly an early example of it in some sense. And the point is that the lack of need to do that, the ability to have maybe not a comfortable life, but a life without having to go that extra effort to integrate into society. You began to notice that early on, I guess.
I noticed that early on, and then also I noticed the problems. So, for instance, there was a lot of compassion. I think there's still a lot of compassion in the Netherlands and other European countries for people who come from places like Somalia. Yeah. But then when those people then break the norms, for instance, the way men were behaving, Somali men from Iran, from Nigeria, from Afghanistan, the asylum seeker center I went to, there were lots of people from many different countries. The way these men were behaving towards women was against the norms and the laws of the Netherlands. And there would be a lot of complaining, why are they doing this? This is wrong, they can't do this. But there wasn't any corrective measure. I would have thought that this is, again, in hindsight, I would have thought that is the exact context where you could begin classes or courses where you teach them about, you've now come, you elected to come to this country, you've sought asylum here, you're in the process of wanting to be accepted. Well, here's how we live, here are our laws, here's how we treat our women. Mm-hmm. And here's what we think about racism. A lot of Somalis, a lot of Muslims who came there were so rabidly anti-Semitic and would just express it in front of Jewish people who work there. And it was never corrected. And so again, I find that really baffling, I still do.
Yeah. No, I can imagine.
Yeah.
Well, okay. I mean, it is bad. Well, we'll talk about that in much more detail, I think, as we go into your book. So we'll get to it. But you in the process, did you studied it at the same time as you were learning Dutch? You got a political science degree, right?
I had left the asylum seeker center by then. They had put me in a home. Like, imagine the generosity of his staff. I come with nothing. Yeah. And over a period of 11 months, I was in that asylum seeker center for 11 months. And I was there because there was a huge waiting list for apartments. But then they get you into a government-financed house, and then you can enroll in all sorts of, vocational and anything that they try to help you to get into the labor market as quickly as you possibly can be accepted into. And it was while they sent me into an accounting class. I told you I'm very bad with numbers.
Yeah, we've talked about that.
And I didn't enjoy it. So I went back, I made friends, and I talked to my friends and I said, this is really what I'm excited about. I just want to learn how these things work. I want to go and do political science. And my friends, not members of the government, not the subsidized social workers or caseworkers, but the friends that I made were saying to me, well, here are the 3 best places to go to if you want to take up political science. And if you want to improve on your Dutch classes, and if you want to do this, and if you do, I was assimilated by my friends.
Friends and not the government. Oh,
interesting. Not the government, not the caseworkers, not the subsidized infrastructure that really wants these problems to go on. Because if they resolved these problems, then they would be out of a job.
Out of a job. We'll get to that. The immigration, what was it called? The immigration. I forget. Well, we'll get to it. You have a way of saying basically it's these people who are in business to make sure that things don't change. It's interesting you say that. Do you think if you had a different group of friends, you could have been you would have suffered a fate that might have been more like some of the people in your book?
Well, yeah, I mean, it depends on, you could fall in with friends. I could have fallen in with Somali friends.
We choose our friends, I guess, too, though. I suppose it's.
You could eat cat and just and gripe day in, day out, or you could fall into, there were also lots of opportunities to get into, if you call that an opportunity, to get on the other side of the law, women who were, electing, I don't know if that's really a good word. I find that too harsh and too judgmental coming from me, but who would get into the sex market because it's easy bucks and so on. So, but then I was very fortunate when I was at this asylum seeker center, a lot of young people from the locals were volunteering. And those were the friends that I fell in with. These were people who came, who volunteered to come and help us navigate our way in a new environment. And they've become friends to this day.
Well, that's wonderful. Well, we can thank them all. You chose to do political science, and you say we're interested in what was going on, but surely was the fact that your father studied political science an impact? Was that one of the reasons that you, I assume you never decided to be you never thought of becoming a physicist, for example, right?
I would never qualify. In these days, actually, it's wrong to say. I mean, I'm the kind of, I've got the kind of mind that once upon a time we used to say it's the female mind, refers to numbers, and frightened of them. But no, I wouldn't, it didn't become a physicist. I really did want to understand. I think I had come of age in a household that was affected by politics. And so when I was a little girl growing up, our house was very chaotic. And I thought that chaos was caused by my father's absence. And my father was absent because he had devoted himself to bringing order to the country. And so I thought, well, this was his life goal. This is what he dedicated his life to, and he never achieved it because Somalia didn't go from a dictatorship to a democracy. It went from a dictatorship to a complete anarchy, and it's still in that state. But coming to the Netherlands, I thought, well, how do they do this? If only he could learn their tricks, then maybe, and his colleagues and his fellow activists, maybe they could turn Somalia around to become like the Netherlands. But for me to really, truly understand that, I thought I had to go to school and understand, figure out, get those answers. And I think I did to a large degree.
Oh, that's impressive. It's impressive that at that age you were thinking so strategically. That is impressive. But you at around the same time your faith began to shake, and I want to go into that a little bit. And I was really intrigued that the first person who caused you at least to think about religion as not being an essential part of a good life was Sigmund Freud. Is that right?
Yeah, so this is before I did political science.
I know, but I was intrigued by that.
I took social work, and they're one of, obviously, a major part of the coursework is psychology. So you do have to read a lot of Sigmund Freud. And you have to read this, the conscious and the subconscious and all things Freud. And I have to say, you could say, I mean, you're really analytical. You could say maybe uh, the seeds for my atheism were planted during that coursework, during just getting through psychology and how the human mind works, and all the things that affect you and all. And actually, when I was going to complete those 4 years and become a social worker myself, but then I realized psychology is great if you're applying it to yourself.
Uh-huh.
But if you're leaving this environment and you're going to, I'm going to solve other problems, other people's psychosocial, that's such a tall order, and get me out of here.
Ah, okay. But you did. Okay. Well, no. Again, it's strategic. I'm impressed. But you at least. But I also Freud, and I'm no fan of Freud, but that he
I'm not a
taught
fan
you.
of.
Yeah. But at least give an example that you could have a moral system that wasn't based on God. And I think that's really important for people to realize that you can be moral without God. And my understanding was that he gave you the first inkling that that's possible, but that may not be right.
Well, it starts with then if you apply some of those things to yourself, not like a religious person would apply Holy Scripture,
Yeah.
but in the sense that it encourages you to ask questions, and that the questions that I was asking before I came to the West, that some of those questions were actually justified. Remember, I come from a background where if you ask questions, you're seen as antisocial, as rebellious, as trying to cause problems. And so it's best not to ask questions. That kind of curiosity is always, it's frowned on and smacked down very quickly. So being in the Netherlands and in this environment where we're getting homework, compare Freud to Ellis, what are the differences? What are the similarities? I was just in heaven with that.
Yeah, no, the idea that you could ask questions. Yeah, it used to be that you could ask questions in education. Maybe one day we'll again. But I mean that's, and I'm intrigued by several times where you point out that, and something that I couldn't agree with more as a scientist, that asking questions about our social situation is an essential part of trying to make it better. And I so even if you're not a physicist, you have a very scientific mentality, which is questioning, looking for evidence, continuing to question. And I find that throughout your writing, and that's really kind of amazing. And did that just came out of a love of questioning? It wasn't maybe out of your academic studies as well, or?
No, it's absolutely the academic studies. But I think when you look at, you're a physicist, you look at these the hard sciences, true science, really.
Yes, I'll agree.
Yeah, you get these definitive answers. So something is either true or false. But in what is called the social sciences, that doesn't exist. That certainty does not exist. And my professors, my teachers in the Netherlands would really insist on that all the time. From the beginning of the lesson to the end of the lesson, we would be reminded there is no definitive answer to this. There are some ideas, once translated into practice, that are better than others, but none of them are perfect.
Okay, well that's great, and all of them many have different positives. I mean, I haven't done your level of immigration or being an immigrant. I've moved from one country to another, but it's an experience that teaches you that exactly that not only is no society perfect, but different societies have different good things about them, and it's just, and this ridiculous nationalism that people have, that one place is the best place in the world just because the accident of being born there, as opposed to being born 300 miles away. It always amazes me now when I see that.
Absolutely. And to get really to my religious criticism or awakening, it began, let me say, I was asking these questions about why is the Netherlands a place you want to come to? Mm-hmm. And Somalia a place you want to leave? And then with all of these other people coming from different countries, during my 5 years in political science, the one subject I loved the most was political theory, where there were all these ideas on, what are the best organizational and institutional methods to put society together that give the best outcome to everyone within that society and in relationship to outsiders. And so when my father would say Sharia law applied as it should be, And so then I would look at countries that apply Sharia law. This is Saudi Arabia, it's Iran. There were other attempts that were made in different places like Nigeria and Afghanistan. And I thought that's far from the truth. It's unappealing. People are forced to do things they don't want to. It's based on fear.
Yes.
And threats and lies and secrets. And so that's not a great theory for society. These secular theories are, and then from there, you just can't, once these questions pop up in your mind and you embark on this path to find out what they are, figure out what they are. Remember, nothing is perfect.
Yeah.
But some ideas are better than others. And I just couldn't help but think, with Sharia law, it wouldn't give me what I want. It wouldn't give us what we want.
Oh, okay. Okay. And you're right. I'm biased, but I can't help but think that once you start to think, it seems hard to imagine remaining religious.
It becomes empirical because there were masses and masses of refugees from the theocracy of Iran in the Netherlands and elsewhere. And they want refugees from the Netherlands going to Iran seeking asylum.
Yeah, it's true. It's a good empirical fact, I guess. Well,
but
partly you can. Well, yeah, but partly, I mean, to be fair, let me play the devil's advocate. You can also be fair and say one society is richer than the other. So why would you want to go from rich society?
Why did they get richer?
Yeah, of course. They got, no, that absolutely. We'll get to that, in fact, actually.
No, the Dutch were killing one another the other day as Protestants and Catholics. There was more bloodshed in Europe than anywhere else.
Yeah, it just took a little longer to get, they're a little.
Yeah, they were all mini Afghanistans.
I've always said the problem with Islam is it's just 600 years later, and it's just maybe one may hope, although I'm not sure, one may hope in 600 years that people will be that being a Muslim will be the same as being a Christian, in the sense that you won't believe any of the doctrines. You'll just like to call yourself that, which is what most Christians do. Mm-hmm. I want to move away from this a little. I want to get to the book, but you also, it was around 2001, but then a little later that you read the Atheistish Manifest of one of your professors that really caused you to give up religion. Is that right?
First, I had a boyfriend from 1996.
That'll do it.
All the way to 2001. That's when we broke up. Mm-hmm. And I think it was good for both of us. But I
hope so.
Confrontations on a social level, so law level confrontations between Muslims and non-Muslims were happening all the time. And I thought, the most important thing for me to do is to avoid it. So sometimes my Somali friends would call me and I wouldn't call them back. I wouldn't socialize with them because they reminded me too much of that world I left behind. And I wasn't ready to tackle it. I wasn't ready mentally to say, am I now a Muslim and where do I stand? And my boyfriend would say, I don't even understand why you bother with that when religion is just such nonsense. He was this convinced atheist.
He was Dutch, or he was?
He was Dutch. He was Dutch. And I was within a group, Leiden University, we graduated together. Most of them were atheists. And in fact, to be an atheist was the sort of elite establishment position. And people who believed in God were mocked and seen as, and I felt that was too arrogant. And anyway, when we didn't break up because of this, we broke up for other reasons. But then I moved on and had a new boyfriend, and this is the author of the Atheist Manifest. Yeah. And he didn't only tell me, he didn't just say, that belief framework, whatever that is, you shouldn't be asking these questions. He just gave me his book.
I said, read it.
Read it, and I actually read it.
Wow.
And
lucky guy.
Yeah, and it's a small book, but it's a great book. And I say it's a great book because it did for me exactly what I was seeking, which is ask all these questions. Don't fear the answers, just explore and see where they lead.
That's great. I
don't want to say it's a humble book, but it's a good book.
Yeah, no, that's great to teach. Well, you've heard me say before that teaching by questions, asking questions is the only really good way. Yeah. And absolutely, because you can't convince people of a lot of things, but they can convince themselves by asking questions. Yeah, continued questions. That's excellent. You all not only do you become a sort of an atheist ultimately, but you also partly as a result of September 11th, 2001, you also began to become particularly critical of Islam around that time, right?
9/11 happened.
Yeah.
And I think that was a big deal.
It was for a lot of people.
You're a grown up at that time,
yeah,
and you realized what happened. It was a very big deal. And I think there were a lot of people in my environment, in the think tank environment, academic environment, who were trying to figure out, why did these 19 men do what they did? What is it that motivated them? And it was just a laundry list of reasons people gave, Israeli, Palestinian politics. None of them were from Israel. None of them were from Palestine. Then it was American foreign policy, and then it was colonialism, and then it was this and it was that. And I said, what about if it was just conviction? What if they actually believed on a religious level that what they were doing was right, that this is a declaration of jihad? And I didn't realize how, the reaction from my liberal friends, the atheist friends, that was seen as just a really dangerous way of thinking about it.
Oh, interesting.
Wow. But then that then led me to, and there was a fascination with it. So even though I was condemned for asking those questions loudly and writing essays and articles about it, the journalists wouldn't stop inviting me to their radio shows and TV shows and newspaper interviews and so on. So there was this paradox of, please don't ask that question, but you do it. So you can make a freak out of yourself by.
We'll help sensationalize it. Well, that was good for you. Good training.
Not everyone was a sensationalist, but I think that the question of, so are you a Muslim yourself? That popped up in a radio show. Where she let me go through all the steps of criticizing, Islam and women, Islam and power, Islam and this. And then she said, what about you? Are you still a Muslim? And I made the huge mistake of hesitating and then saying no.
Oh.
And that then opened the doors to threats. And
you started, we all know the death threats you've had because of not only associated with the movie but the books and when I remember the first time I met you, but
started with the public declaration of leaving Islam, because as an apostate, it's every Muslim's duty to kill you. So in that sense, I think it is. It's the other criticisms are fine, but that is, for me, that's a major sin or major crime I've committed, is the public expression that I'm no longer Muslim.
So you had already begun to have experienced death threats. So when you really became under threat of death, you sort of were more used to it. Maybe it was a little less traumatic, but I don't know. I can't imagine it wouldn't have been critically traumatic. And as I say, I've been with you, and I remember the first time, surrounded by security guards, and it's a tough going. But it's amazingly important to be brave enough to do it. And anyway, it's interesting that you've always spoken out about those things you believe in. I was intrigued. I want to go slightly, and this will also be relevant to thinking about immigration. You started working for a think tank which was center left, and then a labor think tank, and then you moved to a political party which was center right, and eventually moved to the American Enterprise Institute, which one would say, I guess now one would call it center right. When I first visited, I would have called it right. But and so there was an evolution at the same time, maybe towards left to right, or have you, or is it just that you've remained the same and the political definitions have moved? What would you say?
I would say I probably remain the same to a large degree. I still believe, so if you look at the conversation, the controversy between center left and center right, if you look at society's problems, how much of it should be left for society to resolve versus how much government should we bring in? I think in that sense, I am solidly in the center. I believe that for some things you really do need the government. For others, you should leave it to the market and society, civil society. But when you look at the problem of integrating immigrants from cultures and societies that are very different, this left-right dichotomy, that framework of trying to understand it, it doesn't work. And what I find, and I'm very angry with upset with my center-left friends, is that they actually used the narrative of compassion and the government should do more, not to help the immigrants assimilate, but to stay in power and to expand their power base. And so they to me, became so cynical. And the cynicism back in 2001, 2002, when I'm with the center-left think tank, is expressing itself in, but we need their votes. So if you go out there and you upset them, we're not going to get the votes.
Oh.
And that was the trade-off. Now, the other side, the VVD, the center-right party, were prepared to say, morally and from a place of compassion, the Netherlands should continue to accept asylum seekers and family reunion and bring more immigrants in. They were willing to accept that, but they wanted to apply tough love. And that, I think, in that sense, I would say, even though the left-right framework thing doesn't work for the assimilation process, but the center-right groups were way more interested in dispensing that tough love approach. And that tough love approach has been demonized to a point where it's a lose-lose situation. So immigrants don't get to assimilate and get absorbed into the labor market or the values and norms, and they're causing lots of problems. This book, it focuses on what is changing for women because of immigration in negative ways. We can't talk about it because the whole tough love package is seen as monstrous.
Okay.
And the other side, they don't have an answer. They just want the votes. And so that's very, very upsetting. And it's not different. It's worse in America than it is in Europe.
Yeah. Well, that the problems of it. You did say somewhere in the book, I'll get to it, that dealing with immigration in Europe now is more to the right of the United States in a lot of places. But we'll get to that. But the point is that to deal with immigrants, you need. I mean, the one thing you would agree with is that government plays the primary role in dealing with trying to help immigrants assimilate. It's not the private industry or or the private sector that does that or should do that.
The government should. So the government is in charge of who comes in and whether they stay legally or whether they should be deported. So government is in charge of evicting the people whom they have decided are not allowed to be in the country, and then providing, and here I think I'm more of a social democrat but providing the resources for then creating some of these courses that civil society can't do. That is the case in Europe. In America, I think the history of assimilation in America is very, very different. But in the Netherlands, for example, other European countries, it is government that provides these resources for language classes.
Yeah.
There are some private language classes of superior quality to what the government provides. But then if you're just an asylum seeker entering now, you can't afford those classes.
Sure.
And so there's that. I mean, I want to navigate that. Who do you pay for and how do they pay back and so on?
Yeah, no, I mean, Europe provides those services that the United States just doesn't, and then suffers for later.
Yes.
By not having provided them. People tend to think it's a way of saving money, but in the end, it's a fool's way of saving money because
it's a fool's way of saving money. But also remember what I told you, it wasn't the caseworkers paid for by the government that were responsible for my assimilation.
Yeah.
I made friends and I made an effort to try and get through these language courses and navigate. That was done by friends.
But your preference would be, if you don't mind, but your preference would be somehow to have a government system that did what your friends did for you.
No, my preference would be in the space that the government controls. So an asylum seekers center in the Netherlands is a government-controlled, government-paid-for space. And if within that space you start the initial steps, and as an individual leaves, now you're being housed, I think it's then the responsibility of the individual. And I know that there are numerous, every country you go to, numerous volunteers, people who are not paid by anyone, but who want to do good. And I think then it is part of the responsibility. And I think you should hold an individual immigrant accountable for what have you done? What are the steps that you have made to improve your own life? And asking those questions and trying to figure out the best setup is not, it's not apostasy. These are real questions, but what you run into all the time, including I live in the Bay Area, and San Francisco is rotting. Michael Schellenberger, who loves San Francisco and environmentalist, he's written this book called San Francisco.
Yes.
Francisco.
Yeah, I know the book.
So we run into the same problems of there is a large infrastructure of people who take government money and promise to solve these big social issues. They don't, and they oppose those who want to do it differently. And so this isn't a unique, I think it's an affluent society problem.
Well, it's a problem. It's interesting. I don't know how influenced I was, but I just did it'll come out after this one, but I had a discussion with Charles Murray, and he, of course, as you know, because I guess he's a colleague, at least he's a colleague at AI, claims to have done a lot of studies to show that there's limited influence you can actually do in a lot of these programs, and he's been vilified.
I'm a fan of Charles Murray, and I also and Shelby Steele and Thomas Sowell and all of these guys who looked at at blight in the United States of America, particularly within African American families, even though Charles Murray also actually looks at poor white families.
Yeah, sure he does.
The breakdown of a number of institutions and the correlation with blight, with homelessness, drug abuse, family breakdowns, all sorts of traumas, that's now well documented. And I think it is, it's immoral now to hide away from that truth and to pretend that reparations for slavery that will resolve the problem, or just this fixation on racism.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's ridiculous.
In America, we fixate on racism, and in Europe, they fixate on colonialism. Why is it that so-and-so has abused a woman? He hasn't been to work. He's on government welfare. What can we do about that? And they start conversations about colonialism.
Yeah, you're finding these explanations that have nothing to do with the specific causes for this person, and labeling them as something else. And it's interesting. We'll get to, you have a chapter also. It's culturally, or at least part of a chapter, individual responsibility versus group. The sense of victimization, which you've argued in some sense is also built into Islam, but we'll get there. I promise we'll get there sometime in the next 6 hours. Anyway, but before, I was intrigued by the AEI. I've never asked you this personally. I remember when I heard you moved to AEI, American Enterprise Institute, and I'd been there, as I think I've told you, and I lectured there, and then eventually I thought it went well, and then I was told afterwards that I shouldn't come back. But anyway, I thought it was a coup. I thought, for me, it was the first example of what I thought of as the right usurping sort of issues that were the left. But now I see, for the most part, the left have abandoned those issues. But I saw the right taking you in as this as a very brilliant publicity. Maybe not publicity stunt, but I'm wondering how that AEI thing happened. If you don't mind talking about it. If you do, it doesn't matter. We can move on to other things. But it was a brilliant move of someone's part. So,
the Netherlands is a small country,
and
I don't think that the AEI in 2004, 2005, 2006 were paying a lot of attention to the Netherlands. I don't think that. What happened is when Theo van Gogh was killed, it's November 2nd, and
made a movie? Who you helped make a movie with him? It's very famous. He was stabbed, and this movie submission. You were helped make it, and that was a major international event, which I knew about at the time anyway.
Yeah. This was 2004. I was in Parliament. My term was going to end in May of 2007. if the cabinet made it through. We have a coalition system in the Netherlands, so you don't know if the cabinet's going to make it through to the next election. And if it was going to make it through to the next election, I didn't want to re-seek election. I actually hated being in politics.
Interesting.
And I think I hated being in politics because I idealized, I came out of political science and thought that's what it's all going to look like, and it wasn't. It was different.
Yeah, no. You can say what you believe. You can say what you think if you're not a politician, and if you're a political scientist. But when you become a politician,
this pursuit of the truth and critical thinking, and once you go into parliament, you realize, oh my gosh, it's the opposite.
Yeah.
So I decided I wasn't going to seek re-election, and I was going to do something else, which became it became very clear very quickly to me and everybody who cared about me that I couldn't do that in the Netherlands, that I had to go somewhere else, get out of that pressure cooker. I was surrounded 24/7 by security people. I was being moved from safe house to safe house. It was pretty dramatic. At one point, I was moved out of the country to be safe.
Yeah.
While incredible. Still serving in parliament. So that was very odd. Anyway, I had made up my mind and I started applying for jobs in the US. I went to Washington, DC with a Democrat friend of mine. And we started shopping for a think tank that I could work for, who would accept me. And we went to the Brookings Institution, we went to the Rand Institution, she took me to Georgetown University, she took me to George Washington University. And then at the very end, she said, I have this friend at a place called the American Enterprise Institute. And I remember recoiling and thinking, no, not there. And she said, but he's a Democrat and his name is Norm. And let's just go see what they say. And everywhere I went, we did this whole interview thing, who are you? And they fully understood the picture. And Carlin Bowman, who's still with the American Enterprise Institute, said the Iraq war was raging. And I was expressing what I thought about it. And she said, do you want to write a piece for the Wall Street Journal? And I did, and it was published. And then she said, we'll follow up very quickly with you. And before I knew it, the president back then, Christopher Demuth, Chris Demuth, he's such a dear friend. He was the president, and he said, yeah, we're going to follow up. And he talked to me. We had, I think it was lunch or dinner, and he did this due diligence interview and that whole background. So this is in 2005.
Wow.
And then the others never got back to me. The Rand Institute came back and said, you don't do what we do, so I don't think it's a good fit. But none of the others, even though they expressed admiration, none of them wanted to have me. And then I went back and forth with the president of the American Enterprise Institute, and he said, as soon as 2007, do you want to start tomorrow? And I said, no, I have to sit. I've got to wait until the next election. He said, when that happens, just give me a call and we'll work out the process of getting you here. And that's how it came about. The cabinet fell because of my passport, and there was this scandal. I had been accused of lying. A documentary was made, and this is what I think. Another thing about my bitterness and anger with the left, people on the left, is they don't like your arguments, they don't like your questions, they don't like your theories, then they set out to demonize you.
Yes. And
that demonization process was unfolding, and that's precisely why the think tanks on the left didn't want to have me, because I had been framed as a rabid right-wing Islamophobe. So when I called him and I said, well, here's what's happening, and there's this whole scandal, do you still want me? He said, absolutely.
Okay.
And that's how I ended up with the American Enterprise Institute. He went to the board of trustees. And everybody there was true to their word, welcoming, compassionate, then went into this overdrive to help me get immigration papers settled, because you have to, vouch for this person. I know. So my experience there is I'm now part of a family, the AEI family.
That's wonderful. Well, I always wonder whether it might, I'm obviously behind you, but because at the time I thought AI and Wall Street Journal, and now, 14 years later, the place I publish is the Wall Street Journal. And
well, the Wall Street Journal is amazing. If I send them a proposal that they think is rubbish, they literally say that.
Oh yeah,
If
that's
Ayaan
right.
is published, we're not going to do it.
But the different, but what,
Send them
but
something,
neither is.
they'll publish it. But
Yeah,
it's
but
that
it's
kind of book.
exactly, they're open about that. But at least they'll publish it. But what one finds is exactly what you said, is the left begins to demonize. I can't. I used to write for the New York Times. I used to write, and now I can. The places I publish I'm now called a right wing pundit. And it's
Yeah,
kind of amusing for me to see that as a
yeah,
relatively left wing. But you've experienced that. I mean, so there's two aspects again of things that have been really on my mind a lot, which is cancel culture and this nonsense about offending. I just wrote a piece for the
yeah,
National Post in Canada, which is the Wall Street Journal of Canada, I guess one could say, and on which I'll send you on offense. But you were canceled. So you wrote about that in 2006 in a speech I think you gave in Berlin about this the importance of the right to offend people as a fundamental right. And
yes,
that you're way ahead of the game as far as I was concerned. I mean, as far as my own thinking. And then you were also canceled in 2014. You had an experience, which again, a number of us have had, of
yeah,
I think getting an honorary degree and then having it withdrawn. In my case, one of the honorary degrees was withdrawn sort of privately, not publicly, so it never
yeah.
became a scandal. But you've been a part of both, and so of that vilification process and cancellation process, which is so nefarious today.
Yeah, and I had a lot. So first of all, the cancellation and free speech confrontations that I was a part of was all centered around insulting Islam
Hmm.
and Islamophobia, and this attempt by a minority group in Europe and in America and in Canada and other liberal societies who were saying, we want an exemption just for ourselves. It's okay if you want to insult Christianity, it's okay if you want to insult any other kind of ideology or religion, but we just want an exception for us. Yeah. And so when I gave that speech in Berlin, it's when that whole controversy broke out in Denmark with the 12 cartoons and Eland's Post and the newspaper that published them was either being vilified or, how do we deal with this? And I remember being really in the epicenter of that hurricane of a controversy and then thinking, well, I think it is very, very important to go and state, and I don't even remember what else I said in the essay, but my headline, which the group who hosted me wanted to change, was, no, I'm here to defend rights to offend. That's the rights First Amendment defends. When you talk about free speech, it's not about good manners. And I love good manners. I think there's no need to offend for the sake of it. But the ideas that offend, that's what's protected. And so you can't get away from this by saying we're going to avoid. And I think my message was, if you really, truly, truly accept Muslim minorities, you're going to make them a part of that. Mm-hmm. And then fast forward, here we live in the United States, and we don't have only a small group of immigrants who identify as Muslim who don't want their religion to be insulted. We now have all sorts of groups, women's groups. We have who are saying, I don't know to what extent women are a group in any way, but the demand is this with the Me Too, that if I accuse a man of sexual misconduct, I, the accuser, is always right. You're guilty until you're proven guilty.
Yeah, that's right.
And I thought, how can that be good for women? That's terrible.
What a novel thought.
Yeah, we can't. No. That's not how it works. It is, I want to have an environment and an infrastructure that allows me as an accuser not to be vilified and victim blaming and to be protected from that sort of thing. And that's in a court of law or the court of public opinion, but he has the benefit of the doubt, surely. And we should engage in this, truth-seeking mechanism to get to the point where if the accusation is justified or not. But that's one. And then there's the transgender community. And I don't really think that individuals who are transgender are the ones who are seeking all this attention, but there's a group of activists, very militant, and probably the most dangerous of all of them. They're not like the Islamists trying to blow things up, but boy, Are they causing trouble? And I would say, I always want to ask the transgender activist, why on earth would you take the smallest minority and set them up against 50% of the population? Because when they come after women,
Yeah.
like the numbers are just not right.
Yeah.
I think we can work this out, and so on. And so, I mean, what is to stop then other religious minorities from saying, and I want an exception too? What is to stop all these fights that have been happening since time immemorial on a class level for everybody to claim some form of exemption from? And then how does that make us a society? And what makes it different from tribalism? Because if you go to Africa and places where you have the tribe based on bloodline or the clan, that's exactly what it is. It's just, you have the in-group and the out-group. And the out-group
this is a perfect segue. The idea of why should people have exceptions to the notion of the fact that we have to recognize that we can't give a free pass to people on the basis of religion or some guilt. And so I want to get there. I want to move. That's a perfect way to move into it. I will say, by the way, you're not allowed to use the word tribalism anymore because that's also offensive, apparently. As I just wrote in an article, the Journal of Hospital Medicine censored and removed an article that had the word tribalism in because it hurts people.
My response is, and I think it should be yours and everyone's, is I use any word that I want to use.
Oh, absolutely. Well, as I said somewhere, but I almost wrote it in a piece, but I didn't. But when I was a little kid, we used to be told sticks and stones will break your bones, but names will never hurt me, and that's how we used to sell it people. But anyway, in any case, and the other thing, I don't know if I ever told you, but I actually got one of those cartoons in a physics paper I wrote. So somewhere I have one of the. I shouldn't say this because maybe there'd be a fatwa, but I did change some of the words. But it's in one of my physics papers. I felt ethically obliged to try and put it in a paper around that time. So
I have to say to you, I have more Muslim friends than 20 years ago, and these are true Muslim friends, not because we're in the same in-group.
Yeah.
And they come from everywhere, and we all agree on, my Muslim friends and me, we agree on going through that period of time when questions were asked. And the Prophet Muhammad, the founder of Islam, was criticized, and the Quran was criticized, and authoritarianism in the name of Islam, all kinds was criticized, and the way women are treated was good. They said that has actually really been the best thing to happen to Islam, because you see now more and more young people moving towards an attitude of critical thinking and asking questions, and without giving up their Muslim identity. And so it's really
That'd be great.
Yeah.
That'd be great if it's true. I haven't seen it, but then I'm not a part of it as you are. Well, look, the idea that no group should get a free pass is combined with your ultimately your scientific attitude, the right to offend. Truth hurts, but who cares?
Yeah.
Too bad. And you wrote once, I wrote this down because I loved what it said, is that communities cannot reform unless there's a, quote, scrupulous investigation of every former and current doctrine. What a wonderful mantra, and and of course a scientific one as well. But I think if that were true, which is in my mind a scientific approach to the world, then it would be better. And I think you expressed it perfectly.
That acknowledgement goes to my professors at Leiden, the ones that I was exposed to between 1995 to 2000. And that's what a university does. That was their, I call it their doctrinal attitude. These kids come, and that's what they taught us, that they give us, I think they would be very happy if all of us had maintained that attitude. And look now what universities are doing. And I don't know where Leiden is at, maybe as an institution, it's immune to these new developments, but back then that was.
Well, it's got a distinguished. All I know is it's got a very distinguished physics history. I visited a variety. I've lectured back in the days when I used to do that at a bunch of Netherlands universities. I have a bunch of very good friends who are Dutch physicists, but not Leiden. I haven't done that yet, but it has a very distinguished history. In any case, those two mantras of scrupulous investigation of every former and current doctrine, and you argue basically that we have to investigate the doctrine of how we, especially in Europe, of how immigrants, especially from Muslim countries,
Yeah.
are treated, and not being afraid of offending. I think right in the introduction to that book, and we're moving into the book happily. And I have, just so you know, we'll see how many we get. I have 23 different questions there. We'll see. We'll see if,
And I have 10 minutes.
well, we know. I hope we can. Do you only have 10 minutes? I was hoping you could go 2 hours. Can we not go 2 hours?
Why don't we wait for an interruption from
Okay, from the
from
real
my
world.
family? Yeah.
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 Okay. Good. I hope so, because yes, I really was hoping we'd go 2 hours. So let's see. I mean, I could go a lot longer too. But you say prey is about a cultural problem that migrants bring from Muslim majority countries to Europe. Even though the principal victims are women, it's still difficult in today's increasingly intolerant quote unquote cancel culture to write on this subject. My view is that foreclosing certain avenues of inquiry ex ante is the antithesis of the scientific method, and of course it is. It makes little sense to insist that immigrants cannot be seen to be overrepresented in sex crime statistics, and that it's better not to publish such statistics rather than risk exacerbating anti-immigrant feeling. Such obscurantism never ends well. It's basically almost sort of the thesis of the book in a way. Or the, and let me read at the very beginning. You say, from your personal experience, the point of this book is not to demonize migrant men, rather it's to better understand the nature and significance of the sexual violence that has occurred in so many parts of Europe in the recent past. As I was researching for this book, the Me Too movement shone a light on sex abuse. I found myself wondering why an equally bright light was not being shone on the more often serious crimes against women in lower income neighborhoods in Eastern Europe. So that people were, we see all these stories in the headlines and the news in the United States having to do with Hollywood stars or things like that. But what was going on to people that weren't people who would sell newspapers, if you wrote about them, you didn't hear any discussion at all. And I think that's what's really important. It's, you say, time and again in my career, I've come across authorities and commentators, including self-described feminists, who are prepared to look the other way when it comes to harassment and abuse of immigrant women at the hands of their own men. Afraid of being called racist, these women strike an apologetic tone on behalf of those who assaulted them, some even apologizing for bringing them to justice. And the last quote from this page, which I think sort of summarizes a lot of where you're heading, is, and the media self-censoring their reporting, all in order, it is said, to avoid stoking racial and religious tensions or providing ammunition for right-wing populists. So the point of the book, and I'm worried we may not get to spend as much time on it as I liked, is that there are serious problems with policies of immigration, and you're not advocating keeping immigrants out, which is nice, but you're advocating that we have to recognize, first of all, scientifically and realistically, the empirical facts.
Yeah.
Those empirical facts should then govern policies, and policies can be made that can try to address what is in some sense a clash of culture. If I'm going to sort of summarize the book, as I'm worried I'm going to have to, I hope I won't, but we'll see. Does that seem a reasonable summary?
Yes, it's a great summary. It's exactly what the book is about. And I think every time I have a discussion, a conversation about the book and why I wrote it and what I'm trying to convey and so on and so forth, I learn something new, and I want to say things, just the same thing, but in a different way. So one of the annoying words is immigrant.
Yeah.
Because it obscures so much. If you have, let's say our common denominator is just being human.
Yeah.
And you have men and women, you have girls and boys.
That's a wonderful, rare and new thought, that we actually have a common denominator. It's so rare to hear that. Go on.
So if you're living in Germany and you're attacked by a white heterosexual male, there is such a huge outrage, not just from the victim and the victim's family and friends, but also the perpetrator's family and friends. The first question is, what on earth was going through your mind when you did that? And if the victim seeks justice, it's quite possible that she will get it because she has this support. And will she face challenges? Yes, because the victim, this is white on white sexual crime, still goes through the shame and why did this happen to me and what part of it was mine? What is this going? What am I going to gain from this? And if you go to a court of law, you still, as the female, you get you don't know what you're going to get out of it. Mm-hmm. It just makes the trauma worse. So given that setting, I want you to then imagine the next scene, which is now there is a man, he's of color, he has dark hair or dark skin, and he engages in the exact same conduct. And the victim now has to say, for you to even take me seriously, as I tell you my story, I just want to put out there, I'm not right-wing and I'm not a racist and I'm not anti-immigration. We're not even talking about what just happened to you. The father and the mother or the victim's family and friends may be outraged, but they also have to express themselves in this is different. So we have to deal with this situation differently. And then the legal system doesn't even want to go anywhere near it. Now, if it happened once or twice or three times, you could call that anecdotal evidence. You could say, we're just going to find this young man, sit him down, talk some sense into him. But that's not what's happening. We're seeing as the number of immigrant men from societies where they're not immigrants, they're native, they're locals, and they behave just as badly towards their women, but a sort of different dynamic applies there. And they come to Europe and they just carry on being young men. And now they're finding that there are crimes that they can get away with, and things have changed. First of all, women are more readily available because in the places where they come from, most women are protected from that, like physically protected. I used to go out with a chaperone, not go out at night, avoid all the situations where something like that could happen. Women in Europe and in America have been told that they're free and protected by the law and by their families. They can do whatever they want. And men are now finding more and more women to prey upon. But
and let me just interrupt for 1 second. The other side of it is that men are never find themselves in the Muslim countries in an equally sort of inhibited position. They can never interact with a woman, and they are or have sex or any of the things that they would naturally want to do, and find themselves equally sort of. Women are protected, but you might say at the same time inhibited. And so are men for this. Anyway, I would just want to.
If something bad happens to you, where I come from, the first question from your own family, your own loved ones, is not, we're going to go after this bastard. It is, well, what were you doing?
What did you do? There? Yeah. What were you doing there? Okay.
And in Europe, if you apply that question, what were you doing there? There is outrage. It's like, I have every right to be there as he was. Why did this happen? It's because he's physically stronger than me. And we've been told for years and years, we have this legal infrastructure that protects those who are physically weaker from those who are physically stronger. It's applied when a native causes a problem like that. It's not applied when the immigrant causes it. Where does it take you? From just a logical perspective. For the immigrant communities, the message is sent, you can behave this way and get away with it. If they ever get caught, or if the thing makes itself to a court, they may get a lenient sentence, they may get off lightly, but they have a criminal record. And that impacts your future in the labor market. Mm-hmm. And so it's not as if they're doing you favors, because you still have that criminal record right there. For the victim and for women, the message is clear. Even though you are a taxpayer, even though you subscribe to these laws, even though you uphold the law, you shouldn't be where you get into that kind of problems. And that I found on just that level, I thought, so all this time we were being told, immigrants are going to integrate, it's just a matter of time. And that integration was this one-way path. And now what are we seeing? If you read Pray and in between the lines, the natives are integrating into the cultures that the immigrants bring, and we're moving backwards. This is regression, but it's sold as progressivism.
Yeah, that's a very important concern in your book. It's the fact that that fundamental rights, which were sort of taken for granted in a liberal society, are being eroded because of a concern of sort of accommodating a culture that doesn't have those rights. And you,
It's called as progress.
yeah, and it's called progress. And you point out, I'm trying to summarize some of this just in case we do have to end a little early, but um, the that there's a chapter where you talk about there are institutional reasons for this, the immigration industry. I remember that's what you called it. But you also said, you say, there's no shortage of people who want to deny the reality of what is happening in Europe. Part of the reason for this is, as we've seen, and by the way, I should say, and since you don't want to talk about numbers, that the first part of your book basically provides the data showing
Yeah.
that sexual assaults have gone up, and looking where not all places can label who's doing the assaulting and when, but when those labels are there, specifically after major immigration moves in 2015, that there's a significant increase in violence against women, and largely the perpetrators, one could say, I mean, again, summarizing a lot of information, are from Muslim societies. So that you provide that data, but then you say, so there's no shortage of people who want to deny the reality of what's happening in Europe. Part of the reason for this is, as we've seen, that sexual assault is often underreported by victims wherever and whenever it happens. But it's also true that it is politically inconvenient for most European governments to acknowledge the existence of this particular crisis. Thus, much evidence remains wrapped in reams of red tape and buried under piles of bureaucratic paperwork. And you say you encountered both those obstacles in writing the book. But you're saying that basically, you talk about Angela Merkel in Germany, and her quote unquote decision to ultimately open the gates, and you point out it was never really a decision. It was really matter rather just not taking action that could have been taken, partly as a result of political backlash. Right? Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I'll start with the last one, with the Angela Merkel
Yeah.
situation. And when I was interviewing German members of the government and the bureaucracy and the media, everybody, first of all, said, I will talk to you, but if you leave my name status out of the book.
Yeah.
And again, I want to point out how crazy that is. If you live in a liberal society where we have, it's an open society, if our society is still as open as we pretend it is, then you would want your name and your position in these things to say, I'm happy to discuss these problems. That's number one. But what does it tell you? It also tells you, beyond the sexual misconducts of some of the immigrant men, what it tells you is the whole deal with immigration in Europe has been in a state of impasse for a long time. It never moves. You have one side of people who are saying there should be no borders, everybody should come in. Compassion is then translated into this unrealistic idea where, if you take it to its logical conclusion, you basically abolish the idea of a nation state.
Yeah.
And that's one side. The other side is, no, we need to deport everybody who's here who doesn't integrate, and we need to close the borders, and we need to go back to, I don't know, whatever the original identity is. Again, I'm describing the extremes.
Yeah.
But these two groups don't move towards the middle where you can figure out some reasonable, rational, logical, set of answers and set of solutions that work for everyone. And politicians like Angela Merkel would enter these debates and then find that it's not going anywhere, and then take on a position of avoiding it. She'd rather talk about the financial crisis, she'd rather talk about Brexit, she'd rather talk about nuclear weapons than talk about immigration. And so every senior member of the political establishment of Europe would rather just avoid it, because it ruins your career, it ruins your agenda. It's the kind of topic that never gets you anywhere. But the problems were getting more and more. Now we have the breakdown from the Arab Spring, country after country, and all of them are sending refugees and asylum seekers and displaced peoples. And then we get to the point of Syria. And I think right there, with her facing the cameras, and that's what the German politicians I spoke to and the German media who observed it said there was no plan. There was no program. She was just faced with the cameras. She came from a good place. She wanted to show the world that Germany is not racist. It's a welcoming place and it has changed since the Second World War. This young girl cries, and that is the straw for her that broke the camel's back. So the whole thing came from a good place.
Yeah, as often things happen, they're well-intentioned. Well-intentioned, dealing with racism is well-intentioned until you turn it into an ideology that claims that everything that happens to everyone is a result of white supremacy.
So exactly, good came from a good place, but then it led to this crisis that she then ran away from.
Yeah.
And so when it's not just that, because that show of compassion was amazing and was good or bad, depending on which side of the argument you are. But showing true leadership would then have been to say, okay, so for many years, we haven't been able to deal with these assimilation issues. Now is the time, and I'm going to set resources aside for that, or use my leadership to do that inside Germany, and show leadership among the other European countries of, we've got to deal with this problem. And she didn't do that. And that's what makes local Germans angry at her.
Well, in fact, let me you begin one when you talk about the broken windows of liberal justice. You quote a Berlin integration officer. I was going to say interrogation officer, but integration officer, Arnold Mengelkoch. In an interview in 2018, he explained that newly arrived asylum seekers are confident that they will be released quickly after arrest.
Yes.
For them, an overloaded and undersourced justice system poses no threat. I've seen this again and again in the course of researching this book. If a man harasses a woman and gets away with it, he may try groping the next one who walks past him or follow another one down the street. And if he gets away with that, he may go further still because it's highly unlikely that his actions will make it to court, let alone subject him to prison or deportation.
Yeah.
And
I like that you put it that way, because the frustration expressed by that man was expressed at every level. It is expressed by the journalist. I said, why are you not reporting on these things? She said, oh, wait a second. I would love to report, but for journalism, she said, it is a lose-lose, total lose-lose, because you report on it and you're told you're empowering right-wing people. The policeman who wants to enforce it is told, they're in the middle of a case. They know they're going to win that case because it's so brazen. And they're told, drop it. And not you drop that one case, but you drop the entire case load, all of these cases. And so on an institutional level, every individual not coming out with their name and occupation are saying, I want to do my job, but I'm frustrated in it. And all that frustration builds up and goes to the level of Angela Merkel. If you look at it even further, you're going to see, so who, which institution is really causing the biggest problem? It's the courts. Because you go and they get away. The courts are so crazy. First, everyone encourages, if you want to, work towards trying to get the judges to look at the case seriously, that culture doesn't play a role. All men are sexually charged in this way. They are all suffering from toxic masculinity.
They're all rapists.
It's a universal phenomenon. So don't bring culture into it, don't bring religion into it, don't bring any of that, the whole background, what makes this particular perpetrator different from that perpetrator. Don't talk about that. That's taboo. Then the case gets on, and there are facts that can't be hidden, which in the book I gave case after case after case. And then suddenly culture matters and says, well, we'll just excuse this one because he had no clue. You see, if I'm in Iraq, under these circumstances, I had no clue that I would be punished for behaving in this way. And suddenly that is an argument that the defense uses to get the perpetrator either acquitted or get a very light sentence. And so it's all this Kafkaesque stuff is constantly happening. Does culture matter or does it not matter?
Yeah, no, well, in fact, you have a great chapter called The Playbook of Denial, where you give, if we had more time, I was going to go through each item, but you list a list of in analogy to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's published on Death and Dying, where denial is one of the 5 stages of grief. You call it the brush off, misdirection, the semantic muddle, bogus research and commentary,
Yeah.
dismissal of honest academics as bigots. I just want to keep reading the titles. Appeals to compassion and platitudes, bad advice and bogus solutions, fear of bigotry and backlash, and the playbook of denial.
And it's applied over and over and over again. Maybe what's missing from that is then the vilification of the Cassandras, the people who say we can't really keep on looking away. This is getting out of control.
Yeah.
Another point, I mean, it's laughable, but another point is they keep saying, if we stop the denial, you're going to empower the right wing. Well, look at the status of the far right in Europe.
Yeah.
In every country, they've now become a major voice. Their parties are now well established. If you had dealt with these problems, you wouldn't give them a chance to have anything to talk about. Look at the Russian disinformation agents. They now have something to disinform about. Solve the problem, and the people who want to exploit these problems, they'll be cornered. It doesn't happen. So the right wing is increasing, the disinformation people are increasing, the Islamists are increasing, the lawlessness is increasing. It's the playbook of denial leads to this lose, 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 except for those who benefit, who take the taxpayer money.
Taxpayer money or get votes. The idea that short-term gain overrides long-term gain, which is a key point. You point out that, say, the case of the left-wing political parties, having seen their traditional white working-class voter base erode, turn immigrants as a new source of votes. So lots of people are looking for short-term, and that's the problem with most of our global problems, including climate change, is that people are looking at short-term gain and not looking down the road and realizing that you lose so much more in the long term by taking these short-term. But I think we're built to, unfortunately, evolution has largely, promoted the idea of, gain in the moment rather than thinking about the, thinking long term is something that we've only come to do well after the fact. And I don't think we're as well hardwired for that on an evolutionary basis.
That is true. And I think the other point, and I think you alluded to it right now, was there is a class problem.
Yeah.
If the things that are happening that I describe in that book were happening to the upper classes, the daughters and mothers and sisters and grandmothers of the upper classes, oh my goodness, can you imagine?
Yeah.
There would be no immigration. They would put up the borders. They would they would deport, they would lock up, they would do whatever it takes to protect their girls. This stuff is happening to working class people. It's the girls. It's happening to the grooming gang. These, Pakistani young men were exploiting working class white girls. And the grooming gangs were blatantly racist, telling the girls that they were exploiting them and doing what they were doing to them because they were white and infidel and all the rest of it. But they were ignored, and their plight was completely ignored, and it affected so many that those girls were so let down. And the whole thing has spread. It's all over Europe. It's happening to poor girls. It's happening to the poor. It's happening to working class women. And what I say in the book, the immigrant women were first, the immigrant women into Europe, they were the victims of the culture of misogyny that men bring from their countries of origin. Cultures of origin. And now it's affecting the working class women. And I think there's a natural coalition there for the Muslim women immigrants and the working class white women to work together and to bring this into the open and to civilize these young men.
Yeah, you make it personal in a bunch of cases. So you talk about sitting in a bus and trying to behave modestly and appropriately and being hassled and experiencing that. And you point out that there's this, well, in Islam, there's this modesty notion which sounds good in the front, but what it does is ends up confining women and frustrating young men, leading to a natural, you say, I'm not sure which came first, confining women to the home or sexually harassing them in public places. There's clearly a relationship between those two things.
Well, and I think, again, if we go back to, how do you understand society and behavior and what do you do? What would be the best set of ideas? It would be obviously what they had achieved in Europe for a brief period,
Yeah.
which was to recognize human nature and civilize young men, make them into chivalrous, protective beings instead of, giving in willy-nilly to their cravings and attacking women by dehumanizing women, and then creating an infrastructure that protects the weak from the strong. And that's now being thrown out of the window. And I really don't understand why they think this is going to go and how, go to a good way, how they think this is going to end.
Well, Amy, you argue it's, and I do want to get to the end of the book because you give 6 different things that I think are important that for trying to get around this descending circle of hell. But but there are a few points that I think are really important to stress on the way. One, which was in the Muslim world in particular, this notion, which I hadn't really thought of. I mean, I see victimhood now, and this notion that everyone's a victim for, instead of just taking personal responsibility and saying grow up. But you point out that part of it is cultural, the sense that that there's a group that instead of individual responsibility, there's group responsibility. So the group, so that the group is offended, and the group and individuals are not either take action or defend it on an individual basis, but more as a group basis, which naturally leads to victimhood arguments. So you want to talk about that a little bit, because I found that quite insightful.
So individual responsibility means that the individual is held accountable for their actions, good or bad. And individual responsibility, I think it also entails that whole process of, due process, and you give the individuals a chance to explain themselves. And that to me would be true social justice, would be to give every individual the opportunity to say, this is my accuser / the other. Group, the whole group thing, what it does is it takes the individual out of the equation. So there is no individual responsibility, that you're not held accountable. If a member of your group does something bad to a member of another group, your whole group reacting, if you're a minority, you say we're being victimized.
Yeah.
If you're a majority, you go ahead and victimize. And so that whole individual responsibility thing is not developed or not seen as valuable. And I'll give you a very clear example. When I was doing the research and saying, I just need to see the numbers for who these perpetrators are, surely it's easy to collect. The European officers were telling me, we don't do that anymore. Because during the 1930s and the 1940s, we held entire groups because of their race or religion responsible for God knows what, and started to eliminate them. So one of the lessons we learned was never to do that again. Okay. So that means you'll never, the statistics, I'm very bad with numbers, but also even getting the statistics, even if you're good at numbers, you won't get them because no one is keeping these records because of something that happened in history. And because of something that happened in history, the new groups who are not a part of that history and who are coming to a completely different context, the individuals within them are figuring out, oh, wow, now I can go and rampage on an individual level. The corrective means within my group, which if you're within the culture, Muslim culture, Somali culture, whatever, the way to keep individuals in line is to stigmatize their behavior. So those forces are not going to come into play. I can get away with it on that level. No, I won't be held accountable as an individual by my own group. And when it comes to exploiting members of the other group, my group will come to my defense, because we can all play the victim and say, you are accusing all Muslims, all Iranians, all Afghans, all Somalis, all. Look at the group thing in there. And the other group is silenced.
Yeah, they're just completely silenced by that.
Victims, yeah. So you then get these warped and perverse ways in which men begin to understand here's an opportunity too irresistible to take.
Well, you also point out, to be fair, and just so make sure that we both get more hate mail, the that it's not just a matter of not being stigmatized by your group because they're not there, but in the Islamic world, there's not there in many cases, in the case of assault, or sexual assault, or abuse of women, there's no scrutiny, there's no scrutiny by the group, or stigmatization by the group. In any case, it's the woman who's often held responsible as a cultural issue.
That is true. And also, as I describe in the book, though, the logic, this is how it works. There's a distinction, I call it the modesty doctrine. And the modesty doctrine works in this way. There are good women and there are bad women. And these are very, the lines are very clear, right? If you're a good woman, you stay at home, you obey, you cover yourself, you know how to avoid places where you can get into trouble. And if you're in group, if they have the capabilities, which is a lot of men, anybody crosses all of that and still attacks you, well, you must feel sorry for that attacker, because they're beaten up, they're castrated, they make a show of, they'll start wars and feuds that last decades over something like that. But if you're a woman who breaks any of those laws, then you're a bad woman, and what happened to you was coming to you because you are living on the edge. So your group will not come and protect you. But if you're also perceived as shaming your group, they will take care of you. That is the basis of honor killing and honor violence.
Exactly.
So these are the differences. And obviously that doesn't apply anymore into the modern Europe. Ancient Europe was different. Even 19th century Europe resembled Muslim world more.
Yeah, sure.
But I want to move forward to just where we had that conversation where you said, we were talking about holding individuals accountable and exploiting opportunities that come up. In the Bay Area, there's now this phrase called smash and grab. And I want to talk to you about smash and grab, just to demonstrate that I'm not talking only about Muslim men or immigrant men. You don't have to be Muslim, you don't have to be immigrant, any of that. You have to be a young man who thinks, oh, I can get away with all this bad behavior. And even, so when in San Francisco, or maybe it's the whole state of California, but I think it's San Francisco, they passed this stupid law that if there was a crime of less than $950 or something like that, there would be no arrests.
What?
Or charges made. Okay, just ponder that.
Yeah.
So basically, shoplifting then becomes legal. And groups of young men, and I think also young women who work with them, thought, wow, so I can go and take all of these products, sell them back on the internet, and it's now become a huge problem. So you see how it is not, we go back to the common denominator, which is the human individual, and the human individual who thinks I can get away with certain things.
Yeah.
If it's sexual misconduct, if it is shoplifting and selling it, whatever, you make the opening, they take it, then whose fault is it?
Yeah, well, and it's often well-intentioned, but good intentions. There's a famous saying about that,
Yeah. So uphold the law for smash and grab, uphold the law against sexual misconduct. The outcome remains the same. You protect the victims.
Exactly. But I want to be clear, though. You do make a point of saying this is not an ethnic question. You really do come down and saying, to some extent, one of the real problem, you ask the question, why isn't integration happened? Why are the societies in some sense moving backwards rather than forwards by trying to accommodate, is a religious one. You say, you say an assumption was that the inherent superiority of secular democratic pluralism would be so attractive that newcomers would soon embrace it. that is not what's happened. For a significant number of migrants from Muslim countries, as we shall see, the values have not rubbed off. This comes down to religious rather than ethnic differences, as religiously enforced attitudes about women inhibit employability for migrants and compel them to form parallel societies where antisocial behaviors such as honor violence and forced marriage reinforce separate systems of laws. All of this combines to lessen the chances that immigrants will successfully integrate into the surrounding liberal culture. And you say, commentators tell Europe to be patient, but it's not happening. So you're basically saying, and you do say it's a clash, fundamentally a clash of cultures, and unless it's recognized as
Yeah.
being that in a realistic sense, it will be hard to deal with.
Yeah, and what you just read is a manifestation of what I would call the Islamist solution. So the Islamists established themselves amongst minority communities, immigrant minority communities, and they want to impose Islamist norms through the mosque, the establishing of so-called Muslim schools and other ways. And the Islamist leadership will talk to the local white established elites and political parties and say, leave the problem to us. We are going to solve these problems. You don't want sexual misconduct anymore? Well, this is what we're going to do. Now, what exactly is it then that they're preaching? They're saying to the young man, do not drink alcohol, come to the mosque. I call it dawah. They preach about how such a young man is supposed to behave himself, but leading him towards a direction where he starts to internalize the modesty doctrine of good woman, bad woman. Yeah. So that's not going to solve the problem. It's still victim blaming. And what the Islamist is trying to sell to the native society is, then women should not be in places where they can be harmed by men. So change your society to resemble our religious vision. And I think that is basically what you're seeing in Europe, is when the people at the center left, center right, and the leadership, when they decide these are problems that they want to avoid, then they create that void, and the bad forces come in, the extreme right wing people come in, the misinformation, the Russian misinformation people come in, and the Islamists come in. And it becomes ever more narrow.
Well, and then you say it's compounded. And by the way, we're getting near the end, so I'm actually getting to the one.
And none of these three forces are good for women.
Yeah, none of them are good for women. But there's an additional force which I mentioned earlier, and you have a whole chapter about, called the integration industry and its failure. And you talk about in Dutch Parliament, for all the money spent, the country could not identify a single success story. Much of it has found its way into the balance sheet of slick consultants, worthy nonprofits, and ethnic community representatives, all promising utopian levels of integration, which never happened. So your point is that there's an industry that it's in their interest to ensure that continues.
Absolutely, it's an industry. It is an army of consultants. They come into parliament, they tell members of parliament, if you sign this into law, and if you sign into that, and if you allocate these resources, we're going to take care of the problem. And then these consultants network with one another, and they have got all kinds of different fancy names, and they placate politicians and the civil service by taking these constant surveys to say, this is, but look, the German population, the Dutch population, the Swedish population, they're not anti-immigrant. So all these rise in sexual misconduct, it's not leading to an anti-immigration, because we've just done these surveys. And surveys say this and the surveys say that. And then we pay money, and they have their jobs, and they have their infrastructure, and the problem gets bigger and bigger. And the bigger the problem gets, the more they're needed.
Well, and then the government becomes, I always used to idolize Sweden when I was younger, because it seemed to be the perfect sort of socialist kind of country. And I like Sweden, so let me make that clear. But you give examples of a breakdown of the rule of law in Sweden about about, that I think is really shocking for a lot of people. So I'd like to hear this is what a rolling back of women's rights looked like. It's a brochure produced by the Swedish government's National Board of Health, with the title "Information for You Who Are Married to a Child." You want to just
Yes.
talk about that for a second, because it's shocking.
What do I have to say about that brochure? That it is a shocking
Mm.
acceptance of child marriage in Sweden, not in Iran, not in Pakistan, not the Taliban of Afghanistan. No, it's in Sweden. And this is then that's sort of the implosion where we've looked at these problems, we can't do anything about it. We're left with nothing but to accept. And when you accept child brides and child marriage because it's happening between your ears to a small group of religious minorities, what if the local Swedes men say, "Whoa, it's legal," because they have pedophilia there? Instead of hiding behind the internet, why can't I just marry her? So do you see the slippery slope of where things are going? If you allow it for one group, or why will you not allow it for others?
Yeah, and then you also say at the same time, the irony is that as a result of all this, European voters are well to the right of American voters on immigration issues. And so that you've got this negative aspect. The right wins,
Yeah.
the forces of regression win, women lose, and liberal values lose, which is
Liberal values.
and so I want to just spend the last few minutes, because you have been indulging me.
So I wanted to say to you, please, on the Swede thing, Sweden, contrast Sweden with Denmark, its neighbor.
Okay, you're right, and I'm glad. I had the example of Denmark, but I didn't want to take time. So why don't you take my time?
But it's fascinating.
No,
because
it is.
Scandinavian and small and liberal, and they have this self-image of being, my goodness. So to me, as an outsider, I look at Sweden and Denmark, and they look alike.
Yeah, they're even connected by a bridge. It's really
connected by a bridge, and yet they had these different approaches. Where the Danes thought, well, these liberal philosophy and infrastructure and principles, they matter to us. We're going to protect that. And they were vilified. They were called all sorts of names, but they did it anyway. So things in Denmark, I would say Denmark today is more friendly towards immigrants than Sweden. In Sweden, they let it rip. And the result is they are now in a place where a majority of their population is saying, just close the borders.
Yeah.
So they went from being so pro-immigration, you don't need borders anymore, to being the most.
Yeah, and that's the problem. If you actually do recognize that there are dangers and concerns from not dealing with things realistically.
Yeah.
Honoring people's rights and respecting them as individuals, but understanding the need to be able to have societies that function. And the last chapter of your book is a series of proposals. So it's not just a book about problems. And I thought I'd spend a minute or two with each of them if we could, and then end with the end of your book. Let me just give you a chance for a minute for each, which is maybe not fair, but the first thing is repeal the existing asylum framework. Want to elaborate on that for a moment? Because
it's unrealistic. There are 1 billion people in Africa. They live in failing or failed states, and most of them will want to make their way to Europe, and they would like to use the asylum system. Similar problem in South Asia, the Middle East, unsustainable. It's become a mockery of what it was.
And you say it's clear that we need to change the artificial classification that differentiates between asylum seekers, refugees, and economic migrants.
Because it's become an excuse for the left and for the so-called immigration and integration industry. It is not a solution to the problem. It is a problem. It's making the problem bigger.
Okay, and then you say address the push factors.
Exactly. So rich countries, I think, have now an opportunity to try and figure out how to help poor countries that send refugees, asylum seekers, into ways of making those economies work, rather than inviting them to welfare states that are not going to hold out for very long. Okay, then you say, as well as the pull factors, and you talk about
in this case, you talk about changing two states that have, in your mind, have done a reasonable job of trying to make the welfare states less attractive in that sense, Austria and Denmark. And let me just quote you from Denmark here. In Denmark, for example, in Denmark, the state provides housing, education, and health care, as well as social assistance. By connecting the provision of these services to the behavior of recipients, the government is trying to break the social and cultural habits that have effectively locked so many Muslim immigrants out of the open society. Children in migrant neighborhoods must now be separated from their parents for 25 hours per week and learn Danish values, or their parents will have their welfare payments cut. In addition, curfews for under 18s are intended to minimize their involvement in street gangs. This policy was later withdrawn for being too severe, but you point out as a potential way of dealing with these.
And I think none of those policies are severe enough. But they're a beginning, they're a start. And of course, I know that we'll have that back and forth of, oh, it's too severe, or it's not severe enough. And then what I hate to see is for it then to freeze in the middle and people to run away from it. But in truth, yes, you do have to deal with the pull factors, right? If you're advertising to the world, come and live here in Denmark and in Sweden and Germany and Holland, you're going to have free everything without people really understanding where that money comes from, without demanding that you pay into it, without, when we go back to the responsibility and accountability dynamic, it's not going to work. And that's what I mean. It's these welfare states unsustainable.
Yeah. And okay, and reinstate the rule of law. Namely, the rule, you say beautifully, the rule of law without enforcement is merely misrule.
Yes, it is. It is. If you've lived in an anarchy, if you've lived in an autocracy, if you've lived in a theocracy, you will come to really understand and appreciate the rule of law as it was understood and enforced in Europe, in America, and still in some places that happens. Lady Justice is blind. Enforce the rule of law, take all these racial and gender and all these things that they're trying to bring into it and have her wink at you. Because you're Black, you can get away with it. You're an immigrant, you can get away, wink, wink. Take all of that away, make Lady Justice blind again, enforce the rule of law for everyone equally.
Then listen to successful immigrants. And I think that's important. And you're an example, I would say, of a successful immigrant. You say, I'm in agreement with, you talk about a variety of successful immigrants, and you say, I'm in agreement with each of these people on the necessary conditions for integrating Muslims into European societies. The core of their views and mine is that we must defend liberal values more robustly, that the rule of law must be enforced, and that individual responsibility is crucial, and that taboo on open discussion of these issues has only made them worse, especially for women.
Yeah. So look at the immigrants who have come, understood, and appreciate the opportunities that they have figured out, have come to love the countries that they have resettled themselves into, and then their advice. And I think the best people I spoke to when I was doing the book, they were the immigrants. And I think I would say, listen to them, and you don't have to, you shouldn't take my word for gospel or anything like that, but
Heaven.
Bring them into the room. And when you give them and don't demonize them. And when you give them a voice, you see, I decided I wanted to dedicate myself to these issues, but most of the immigrants, successful immigrants I see, they're not in the integration industry. Yeah. These are engineers, they're scientists, they are running businesses. If you ask them for their time to come and help you out, don't waste their time. Let them help, let them do what they want to do. And all of them are going to tell you the same thing, which is tough love is better than this fake love that the people on the left profess.
A beautiful way of saying it. The last one is provide sex education to all children, which is namely, yeah. So you want to talk about that? I mean, that well, somehow.
Nazir Afzal, who is a celebrated prosecutor in the UK, he prosecuted the grooming gangs, terrible gangs. He says maybe we should not call it sex education because, again, that has become controversial.
Yeah,
it is really an education in the integrity of the human body and the respect for men and women, girls and boys. It truly is about understanding sex and sexuality and sexual orientation and all the good stuff, all the positive sides of sex. but also all these negative things. And if you give individuals a proper understanding of what that is, then you can hold them accountable. If you don't teach them that as young children and they misbehave, it's hard to hold them accountable. I've seen these young men really confused and thinking, what have I done wrong?
Yeah.
You're accused of rape, or you're accused of participating in a gang rape, and they still don't understand what it is that they did wrong.
Yeah,
But you need education.
yeah, no, well, I'm an educator, so I'm a big fan of education. But you saw it even in this case in the United States of the right wing who didn't want sex education. You'd see the same kind of nonsense happening where the kids just don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, education is the way out of ignorance and poverty and misbehavior, one hopes. It's a real
Ignorance is not bliss, and the religious groups say it is bliss. And then you have the parents who are neglectful, and then you end up with a large number of young men in that sexually aggressive age group who haven't been educated, who have no clue. Some of the grooming gang members, they had no clue that they were actually hurting a human being.
Yeah.
Because they didn't relate to her as a human being. And so when I talk to people like Nazir Afzal, he is putting these men in prison. He wants them to get out, and he wants justice for the victims. But he keeps pointing out to compassion for the perpetrators because they haven't learned and they haven't been taught anything.
Yeah, it's a disservice we do to so many people, and it's
You used to call it civilization.
We used to call it civilizing, but we're not allowed to that anymore. But in your conclusion, I was kind of amused in a way because you brought up my countrywoman Margaret Atwood, but the first line of that I think is really important. You say, as much as we would wish it to be so, progress is not a given. And I'd say with due apologies to our joint friend Steve Pinker, that the progress is not a given, that it can go backwards. And I think that's really important. And you talk about the handbrake scale, which it's kind of interesting because I remember reading at the time, and it was profoundly important because I was concerned about right-wing Christianity, but it seems so out of date now and so inappropriate. It's the exact opposite it's not the danger that I see. I don't see that as the chief danger to women's rights in even in the United States. It's this notion of victimization and identity politics that I think is a much bigger problem. And but you do point out that how new this is. And I want to quote you in the last 2 pages in our last 2 minutes, or our last few minutes. We must not forget that the very concept that women are equal to men is a relatively new one. It emerged only in the West, and despite its advancements from the right to vote to the protection from discrimination in the workplace, it has yet to achieve the complete equality to which feminists aspire. The mythical arc of history that progressives assume bends towards human progress is better described as a pendulum, at least when it comes to women's rights. It swung backward and forward, extending and rescinding liberties to women, depending upon the prevailing ideology of the time. You want to comment on that?
I think a lot of so I'll speak for myself. When I was with you and Christopher Hitchens and Steve Pinker and Sam Harris, and I still am, you're still my family, you're still my, lovely, and we engage with one another. And I think there was the common thread was religion is the biggest source of irrationality, Christianity, Islam, and so on. And I think in a way, one big mistake that we made is that we were too lazy and maybe too focused on the challenges of religion, which is the one we know, to understand that you can be irrational, unreasonable, and enemy of logic and the open society with no religion at all. And that's what we're seeing. And so for me, I'm going to speak for myself again. When I hear the word progressive, I always thought we're moving forward, we're going somewhere, there's a sense of purpose. And then I saw phrases like ancestral wisdom.
Yeah.
And I would look, and then I would listen very carefully to what they were saying and think, but that's not progress. This isn't going anywhere. And there's no religion involved in any of this.
Yes.
But it's happening in all of the academic settings where I am, where millennials and the younger generation, they're posing these things of there's something lovely and beautiful and wonderful about being savage, who saw all of them.
Yeah.
And I thought, but that's not progress. And it's just how we use language, the way we use the word science and progress and this and that. And I think the people like you and me and Christopher, who passed away, and I think his legacy needs to be republished so everybody can see what it was.
Sure.
And Sam and Steve Pinker, we need Sam Harris, Steve Pinker. We need to get together and say, how can we figure out a way of fighting and pushing back against this obscurantism that is secular, that is
it's secular religious. It's a secular, it's a secular religion, and it's and this love of ancestral wisdom, and I think we may have even talked about it in your podcast. It's terrifying for me because I see it and all of these well-meaning scientists are supporting this nonsense of having indigenous knowledge treated the same way. You just saw it in New Zealand. There's ancestral indigenous wisdom. Yeah, and that somehow that it should be taught alongside physics as if it's equally valid science. And you may know that in New Zealand just last week, some scientists who wrote and said, hey, this, we got to respect the Maori culture and everything it's done, and that's great, but we shouldn't teach the Maori, physics along with, or lack of physics, one should say, along with physics. And they've been ostracized, and it's been suggested they be removed from the New Zealand Royal Society of New Zealand. It's just disgusting. And let me read your last.
It's more than it's crazy.
It's crazy, and in fact, you actually say in that regard, I should say, you say in a related way, you say today, by contrast, feminists steeped in multicultural ideology excuse the inequality imposed upon women across the Muslim world, including the perilous societies of Europe. They pointedly, quote, respect, quote, this misogynistic culture rather than agitating for it to evolve. Western feminists have effectively relegated their Muslim sisters to the past. They are sleepwalking as their own rights begin to be eroded. It's a beautiful sentence. But again, it's respecting this ancient nonsense
it's nonsense.
Yeah.
It's ancient to you, but if you are growing up with my grandmother, right?
Yeah.
My mother, and in Africa. So it's not that ancient to me. When I was in all of these places, that what you call native or indigenous ancestral, it's superstition. And if you want to say, I'm going to teach superstition alongside physics, good luck.
Well, it's bad luck is what's going to happen. And let me read your last few sentences of the book because I love it. In writing this book, I've come to the conclusion that we need a new women's movement, one that views the world not in terms of multiculturalism and intersectionality, but in universal terms, and that, in the spirit of John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor Mill, is prepared to stand up for the rights of all women. Women's safety from predatory men is the issue around which all true feminists must rally and coalesce. We women can and must refuse to be relegated, as we have been in the past, as I've been in my own lifetime, to the status of prey. I hope you will join me in this endeavor. All I can say is amen.
Thank you. And remember that feminists are not necessarily women, that in fact the most powerful and effective feminists in our history have been men.
And I will say that I'm happy that, I don't think I've ever said this in public, but when I was, my wife, who didn't like me originally, she met me, or I didn't think she would, we didn't have a good meeting, but she, for some reason, ended up reading a piece I wrote saying, educate women, save the world. And all I can say is it's worked out very well for me because we're now married. But it's a very important thing. It's something on which we both agree in a less facetious sense. It's a vitally important thing.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Educate women, liberate the world, educate women, make the world a more peaceful place and a healthier place. Educate women, educate girls, but also educate boys.
And educate, exactly. And there are fewer boys being educated.
And I'm a masculinist, or whatever they call it.
Yeah, in fact, as you know, we have fewer boys in college now than girls, and it's a problem. Well, educating people, and you are the most beautiful, wonderful example of an educated person. One of the ones I know of. Every time I'm with you, I feel enlightened and raised. And thank you for taking more time than you'd planned to spend with me. And I hope,
like I said, I will stay here until I get interrupted, but now I can hear the noise, and I think all your guests will probably hear it.
No, I can't hear them yet, but you may have heard my dog barking too. He agreed with you at one point. But thank you again, Ayaan. It's always a pleasure to be with you, and I'm sure that you will have enlightened those who were lucky enough to listen to you today.
Lawrence,
so
thank you so much. Thank you so much. I wish I could praise the way you do. I can't. Thank you so much. You're amazing. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. You can continue the discussion with us on social media and gain access to exclusive bonus content by supporting us through Patreon. This podcast is produced by the Origins Project Foundation, a non-profit organization whose goal is to enrich your perspective of your place in the cosmos by providing access to the people who are driving the future of society in the 21st century and to the ideas that are changing our understanding of ourselves and our world. To learn more, please visit originsprojectfoundation.org.